Okay, this is a big one of those key terms that we need to know the meaning of, and the term is dramatic irony. Dramatic irony. Now then, what do we mean by dramatic irony? The simplest way of learning about it and understanding it is when the audience knows something that the characters don't. And when the characters speak, as an audience we're shaking our head and smiling and thinking, if only you knew. Where do we see it here? Well, we need to remember the context of this play. By context, in this case, the time it was written and the time it was set. Because remember, this play is set in April of 1912, just before the sinking of the Titanic, before the First World War, before the Second World War. This play was written at the end of the Second World War and performed just after the end in 1946, 45-46. So we have an audience who know that the Titanic has sunk, who have lived literally just through a horrendous war, and who have a very close knowledge of the First World War. Okay, so think of the type of people that would be watching this play, particularly knowing what they would have known about J.B. Priestley, who was left-wing, who was quite anti-establishment, who had spent the war really trying to keep the troops' spirits up, but who clearly had a very, very, very clear and obvious viewpoint of war. Okay, so we've got an audience who are cynical, who are tired, who are exhausted by what has happened, and who are looking through the window of a prosperous family in 1912. An Edwardian family, but very much with Victorian values of hard work, and it's the hard workers who should earn the money. So the irony is this: Birling says, there's a good deal of silly talk about these days, but you can ignore all this silly pessimistic talk. When you marry, you'll be marrying at a very good time. Soon it'll be even better time. Last month, just because the miners came out on strike, there's a lot of wild talk about possible labour trouble. Don't worry, we've passed the worst of it. Of course, we know that they haven't passed the worst of it. Because in the late 20s and early 30s, largely because of the First World War, there was the Depression, and there was a vast amount of poverty and real hardship. So that there is absolutely no way that they've passed the worst of it. But then he goes down at the bottom here. Just because the Kaiser makes a speech or two, or a few German officers have too much drink and begin talking nonsense, you'll hear some people say that war's inevitable. To that I say, fiddlesticks. The Germans don't want war. Nobody wants war. There's too much at stake these days. Everything to lose and nothing to gain by war. There we are. Perfect example of dramatic irony. The audience of 1946 are watching this and thinking, Birling, you have no idea what you're talking about, because we know something you don't. We know that war is inevitable, because there will be 2 world wars, millions of people will lose their lives. So what we get is a kind of a cynical smile that the audience will make when they watch this, because they will know that Birling really doesn't know what he's talking about. And as I've mentioned in a previous screencast, characters represent types. Okay, we talked about Eric representing a certain type, and Birling represents a certain type of person. He represents the type of man that has come out of Victorian prosperity, the time of Queen Victoria, up until the very, very beginning of the 20th century. He represents a man who assumes that because it's been good to that point, it will continue to be good, and that if a lot of silly people talk about war and strikes, then they really have no idea what they're talking about. And it's this arrogance which is totally destroyed by the events of the early part of the 20th century, by the sinking of the Titanic, by the First World War, by the Depression, and by the Second World War. So the audience that watched this play in 1946 are a very, very different audience that would have watched the theatre in the early part of the 20th century.